Got him. All right, so check it out. In the image of the mediatrix of all grace, she's standing in front of Jesus, and it's Jesus' sacred heart. The light is emanating from his head, and it's shining down into her palms, and from her palms it's reflecting down into the world. And so a lot of this imagery, this is exactly why people end up getting confused about what we mean about these things within our faith. Because it's always a reflection, and it's always a pointing towards or an emanation from, if that makes sense. So it makes way more sense in Spanish, I would say, or no, I shouldn't say I would say, but one of the godfather of my children pointed out when we were talking about functional programming, he was like, if it would be easier to explain these things in Spanish, and it would, because that's what the verb tenses are describing. I didn't know that. Spanish, I mean, I'm sure there's a trillion ways. I don't even know how. But one of the things you could say about something having been in the past, or reference to the past, is que algo estaba o algo ha sido. And ha sido is intrinsic in it, is a process. It's something that is evolving. Porque si ha sido, entonces es y será. And that structure of language is something that's very near and dear to our heart, because these are all of the contemplations that we've adorned our prayers with. So a lot of times people are like, you shouldn't be repeating prayers because it's not coming from the heart, without understanding, like, yeah, you're right. I shouldn't be standing around saying these empty things, right? But it's like you have these frames for understanding, and you can see it. So that's why I was referencing before we brought up the Holy Mother and that specific image, because you'll see that they're all always referencing that. There's always a source to the light. You're never saying it's her. And so with the imagery, whenever you're talking about a saint, automatically you're referencing they're remembered for something, and they're remembered for something in their relation to Christ, in their expressions of the keys and of the values laid out by Christ. And it's fascinating because oftentimes you're looking at this and saying, when they talk about the West, they act like we were always a Christian conglomerate, even when at the height of our empiricism, we were saying it under this Christian conglomeration. But then when you start looking at the martyrs, it's like, well, you know what I mean? Like, where did that come from? It wasn't things foreign to our system. It was these people in these specific places where, you know, just through the evolution and the unfurling of everything that was going on, they ended up in these kinds of situations. So everything is meant to be representing what it is that it's representing, right? So once we started kind of going into these frames, and when we started looking at these, how would I even describe it? At these description of objects with more dimensions to them, where values at these dimensions are bound automatically to certain aspects in other ways. And it's just, if you would try to draw it, it'd be these crazy charts. So you can't. It's not, and it's not quite an intuition, you know what I mean? Like, we all have an intuitive understanding of light and the movement of light and how it reflects off of surfaces, and it creates these constructs, and how there are emanations of emanation and emanations of emanations and emanations, and each reflection is a slanted version of the original and all this. So it's like with this whole thing going back and forth, I don't know, man. It's just there were just so many contemplations that I ended up finding that were intrinsic to my own faith and my own spirituality, and it was a shining moment to see. And this is what's funny. So I personally don't look at numbers as an object, right? I don't believe in them. To me, these are shadow names. And when you say a shadow name, we are not talking about the darkness. We're talking about the light, if the light itself is a shadow projected down from a higher dimension, which is exactly the way that we express ourselves about all the wonders that we see within this universe. There are things that are going beyond it. That's how we express ourselves about God, not in a crazy way. it's incomprehensible. This is why we don't have words for it. So yeah, so there's all this kind of poetry that I end up seeing, because there's a humility that you are to approach God with. Even if you have the answers, even if you see, it's like, well, who gave you sight to see with? Who put the stars in place to shine the way they have? What wave caused what to explode and project in such a way that now light is here to... And when you read the Old Testament, that's exactly what ends up happening. People feel, oh, I've been selected by God, I'm so special or whatever. And then they go and argue with God, and God is just like, I don't know you any explanations. You know what I mean? Sure, you had the framework down for that part. Like, cool, you have a frame for understanding that problem. I'm not arguing with that. There's nothing else to go back and forth about it with that. So it's fire, because that's the mistake, is that people are always saying about us that you think the image is real, and it's like, no, that the image is not the point. That's just the limit. There were actual events through time. It was composed. There was a traversal. There is meaning there. And it's not in the limit. It's in the nodes. But when you know the nodes and you contemplate the nodes, then when you reflect on the image, it's all just instantly expressed right there. So all these... the issue with science is, for so long, or I shouldn't say science, but you know what I mean? These people who are trying to figure out answers, right? For so long, they thought they figured out the answer. And now they're coming up with ways to formalize randomness. And so when anything happens, they're coming up with formal language to say that anything that happens is itself a miracle, because when we look at what happens and we look back at what had to happen to produce that, and then we find an array of possibilities of the things that could have produced the one observation that we had, and then we pick one, and then we say, of this condition to produce this observation, well, what are all the observations that those could produce? And then we find the place where they're determined and determining. So we're saying now we got, and still within that, there is still a complexity. Let's not even call it an infinity, but at the end, I mean, it is, you know, they do the bounded. So bounded infinities versus unbounded ones, like all this kind of, and then anytime anyone starts saying it, people automatically, crazy, you know, but it's because there's because they're formalizing ways to say, you know what I mean? I don't know. Glory be to God. It's the higher order. So the spreadsheets are ill because in this conception of a limit, it's just an image. And an image can be composed almost infinitely. And the nodes that get threaded together on a traversal to produce this image themselves could be just infinite or whatever. But within this table, then, that first cell, that name, is the binder or whatever it is. And you can attach attributes to this name, to this limit. So some can have 4, or some can have 8, or some can have 12. But it's fascinating because in mathematics, as it was explained to me by a mathematician, that way no one thinks that I'm over here on a, high horse thinking I know things. They were saying when you're looking at a function, and a function with variables, so you could have that, the limit would then be the output of the function, and depending on how many variables you have, then that would determine how many columns there are within that row, where the first column of that row we could call the limit or whatever it is. So if you have x plus, this is where it's beautiful, if you have x plus y equals 5, you would lay that out as 5x y, or yx, even, whatever. Either way, you can have the traversal to say, well, this is what's producing the 5. But then at that point, you can almost plug anything in there. But what's important is not necessarily those variables or the table itself, but the cell, the emptiness. That is what's just, as Michael described it, teeming with functionality, where the moment that it takes a value in there, then it starts operating. You provide it with nothing, it's just there. But the moment something gets placed inside of it, well, then it just gets, ran through this entire process or what. It's all, the processing is already determined. There are these wires or these threads in the background that are kind of taking a value out of a cell and relating it to the other ones or whatever. But then you can start stacking up these matrices one on top of the other, where to me it's like the grid-like nature of it is only useful to describe the fact that something is being contained within a space. But it's more like you each, instead of having a cell on a spreadsheet, you have these tori that people are using to describe the universe, and each one is one of those. So it's just this unimaginable revolving of nothing, just waiting to take anything within it and immediately shoot it out. So there's no way to fully describe anything within a row or within a table, but you can keep on constructing them in massive ways. And this points to the description of art and creativity that Michael keeps pointing to here, where what we're able to do as humans is when we get something that looks like something else already, the frame is there. There is an infinitesimal deviation, and we know what those expand to. So necessarily we're already measuring wrong, and then we're creating these things that even compress those things that we're looking at. So they're really good for answering questions of things that are of the dimensions that are being described. But whenever those little machines are starting to deal with higher dimensionality, then it fails to see the rotation of the higher order. If it's mapping it on a line and the circle rotates, well, now the relation changes. So point to point starts to change. Now, when I thought of this in, I think a set of points as a row, or you could even, whatever, or a column with this up, it doesn't make a difference. You can think of this relation. And so within the table, each value at each cell is related in a certain way, as long as the values that I've mapped from the line into the cells all match, and they do. Now, things can change, that's true. However, if this line is a mapping of a circle of a higher order, well, then when there's a rotation of the circle, the lines that are on the perimeter get a different representation on the linear representation. This is non-linearity. So we can come up with newer and newer ways of adapting to it, which I think is what Euler was pointing at with Euler's identity. It's almost like a lens to look up. So now again, we have this little torus to peer through and take information down. The higher dimensional stuff is crazy as usual. So then we start coming up with ways, like if we're using this Euler's lens from a circle to look up at a sphere, we can fix the rim that we're looking through in order to compensate for the rotation, so that we can get a comprehensible image in from our dimension now, so we can get what's happening with the sphere. But that's assuming that the sphere is turning in one direction. There's an infinity of ways that the sphere could turn. So yeah, we could try to figure those out and get ahead of the curve or whatever, LOL, but it's just so hard to be able to literally manifest that. And I think there are theorems and all that kind of stuff that point to it, which I don't fully understand. For me, and this is why I keep harping with people, I'm trying to figure out. I just got a message. Someone found me on Telegram. That's hilarious. Ryan, of all people, I'm trying to figure out. But it's like if I'm trying to figure out how to represent all the behaviors that are happening up there, at some point it's impossible to infer that, because you just don't have enough of the information. The only thing you can do is get smacked in the face by one of those waves, and in that wave, well, now you have a deeper understanding of the machinations that are kind of happening underneath. So it's like AI is dope for certain things, and I've never hated on it, you know what I mean? I love that it's the computational nature of it, and this is what we need a description of to be able to say that what computation is doing is taking a binary construct, right? And they're only dealing with that. I think the artists in 3D and all that kind of stuff, they're kind of playing with more 3D constructs, because everything is bound at each step or whatever. Those are the higher orders of numerical thinking, which computers we can get a representation of it, like a fast-paced version of it, you know, when we start counting super fast on the bottom end to understand what's going on up there. But, you know, it's always lacking. Not unless we teach our computers to think true. I think this is what the symbolic AI guys were getting at. And I have to read more of their stuff, because when I hear the critiques of what they were saying, I'm like, you know, maybe they didn't have what they needed to be able to instantiate the things that they were saying back then. I don't know. But that, like I said, I don't understand any of that yet, so I can't be speaking prematurely. But it's like, if you could teach it to count different, whatever that means, truly in a number theoretical kind of way, which I don't think we can. So you could almost consider an intuition a predetermined functioning, which when it takes values, it relates them in certain ways. We can look at our sense modalities in this way. And this is exactly what Kant was talking about, these intuitions, that they are structured so the moment that they take data in, they're processing it in a certain way in order to model certain things. So they're automatically bound within that. And then on top of that, as they're taking information in, additionally, they're learning new ways to map this kind of information once they got it. So they can kind of learn new things from taking in, and they can also learn new things from imagining. This is the part where I think the GAN is ill, because they kind of point to that, like, based on these dimensions of reality, here are the kind of different things that we can produce or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's still kind of well, no, I shouldn't even say that, because I haven't studied that enough either. But with the intuition thing, so Kant is like, you never have contact with reality. The objects are really there, but the things that we come in contact with are not what's out there. It's our own internal representation of that. And there's this cycling back and forth, this constant production and learning new ways to produce and then reproducing and all this kind of stuff. To which Schopenhauer responds, hey, bro, yes, we're not in contact with the object, but we ourselves are the object, and we are fashioned in a way that allows us to detect the way that objects could be within this universe. So we're not just making that up. So when we are constructing these models, there are aspects of reality that are encoded in it that are not necessarily immediately available when we look at each point as a point itself. Linear algebra is so ill when they talk about the sheaf, because within a point, within this determined and determining relation, there's infinity. An absolute infinity in a point that is determined and determining. It's madness. It's absolute madness. So to me, when I see these things, though, it's beautiful, because the low dimensional representation of it is this space, but you could see it teeming with life. And the joke that we've been using is the matrix of creation, the matrix of creation. And any image that we produce of it, trying to explain it, is automatically going to reduce the complexity of it. It's like, imagine growing gardens in each cell of a spreadsheet, even having that capacity for it to be that, but like actually that. Not like, imagine if it was like, it's like, nah. Imagine you had the Excel where you could grow magnificent gardens in each cell. This is the matrix of creation. So it's funny when you look back and then you start reading Zhuangzi, I believe his name is. I'm sorry, I apologize for the bastardization of the pronunciation. But he's talking about these bellows, these hollows that are somewhere in the great divine, and there are times when there is nothing, but then it rumbles, and then automatically there are 10,000 things. What a beautiful map, because it's almost labeling probability. They're saying there's nothing, and then from nothing there are just waves of something. Each time these little teeming tubes inside of wherever it is goes, and it's a darkness, and it's a depth, and it's a complete, it's an emptiness filled of emptiness, an emptiness filled of cones and of cylinders themselves that are empty, and their surfaces are zero, and they have holes in them, and they're all turning, and they can be played like flutes, like the hollows of trees, like instruments. And when it sounds, when I'm reading that, the thing I sound is, imagine a forest and all the trees hollowing out, and you just hear a hollow you know that vibrating sound. That's crazy. How do you know that sound without even knowing that sound? And he's saying that in the depths, that is infinity, and that is production, and it is the generating. And so when I thought about the way he was describing it, it sounds like a pool almost, right? It has the shape of a womb, and within it there's a vibration, and when things come to be, I mean, it's populated instantly. And then this ties with what Laozi was saying, when the mistake that we make is thinking in the thing versus thinking that which produced it, which ties back into the tables, where it's not the value in the cell or the cell itself, but the threads behind that are winding and unfurling and taking the values that populate, and then they do but everything is automatically in relation with all of these things. It's like a crystal network. The light hits any facet, it is instantly and immediately distributed throughout everything. And it's beautiful because where the light goes in that image is what Spinoza's description of God was. When he was saying it's just the structure of everything, you know what I mean? And so now you have this structure that Spinoza described, that almost everybody describes in some kind of way when they're talking about these things. So then when you start reading more formalized descriptions of these places, it's like, you guys, it's crazy, right? But you don't know how to sit in the stillness. You don't know how to process doing nothing, how to stand in the desert, desolate, and just pause under a tree where there's shade, understanding if I move, I'm gonna die in less than a day. So I just gotta kick it here for 10 days. And come to find out, I don't even have to eat when I do that. Saturday night, I go to bed, and then I have the most wondrous dream. I'm walking through a vault of stars. I'm in the universe, and before me is a figure. She's walking, and she has a long cloak of stars that are drowned. They're draping. Just they flow down towards her feet and expand behind her. So in a way, I'm walking on the tail of that dress, and it's the universe, and it's this humongous stream just emanating from her and sliding down the veil. And as she's walking, she has her hands pressed together, and her hands are pressing and forming in ways. And as she's walking, it's the hands of God that are in front of her. So when she's pressing down on something, it's almost like a prayer, and then she puts it to her left, and then she pushes it again, and she puts one to her right, and there are these spheres that are hanging there on the left and on the right. And as I'm walking behind her, I walk up to one sphere, and within that sphere was just an infinity of complexity. So I looked within it, and there was extensions, and on those extensions you could traverse one, and at a point you could go into another direction. And so there was just this spiraling and this infinity. You're almost like standing at the center of a room watching all this happen. Then you step away from the sphere and you continue walking down the hall. So there I am walking behind this mother, and she's placing these spheres on the left and onto the right as if they are roses. And when you gaze upon the face of these roses, you have almost an understanding of the complexity underneath, because at each point you understand the twisting to expand is the next. I mean, this is emergence on a I don't know what dimension, but you cannot anticipate where it goes next, because anything can happen. So it's wonderful contemplating all of this imagery, and because it's not about the image itself, right? It's not about the table. It's not about the cell. It's about the threads behind that take those values and connect them and produce things that are meaningful. And so what we say when we see this is, hey, the spirit is moving. And people hear this, and they hear it in a frame that's automatically detached from what they're used to. So they take it in a way where it's like someone is saying something ridiculous. However, it's perfectly acceptable for people to geek out and start talking about Schrodinger's cat, which I'm suspicious is a poorly formed question. Again, I don't have the capacity to explain why I think that, but that's why I want to learn it. Because I feel like he's saying plant corn in June, and then, or plant corn in March, and then check in June and ask, did it bloom yet? Or whatever, you know what I mean? But it's not October. And so I've always felt that in people whenever they, it's all love and it's all games while we're talking and doing whatever. But for myself, the moment I felt slighted in any kind of way, for me, then it was like, all right, I'm about to turn up on this person. You know what I mean? Start clowning and start doing on these things without having the understanding. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily something people have to do. I'm saying that this was my journey. When I'm at a job and I'm good at things that I do and I keep getting fired and I keep bumping heads with people that I consider weak. So I keep wondering, because the alphas never got a problem with me. Alphas don't fire me. I don't even quit from those jobs. It's just like, yo, I can't be here no more. And it's like, hey, I get it, bro, because I'm not going to pay you what you're asking for. But if you got to go and find that, that's what's up. Text me. Let me know how you're doing. Or with other people, you quit, they just turn into a mess. And, it's just this whole back and forth. For me, especially in the workplace, it's like, and this is also a thing I've discussed a lot with the godfather of my children, where people think, when you're being nice to them or whatever, that, yo, this is what it is. But for me, it was like, dog, in the real world, you know what I mean? In the real world, when we're standing around wolves, I am still who I am, I don't have to waver or do anything or project or not project or anything, it's nothing but respect and honor. But I was finding that at work, there were people who would get this voice that they wouldn't have outside. And I would prod at that because I could see it, you know what I mean? And then understanding that other people were watching, I would make sure that I would do it in a way where now you can't say anything, right? So now any little thing they could try to get me caught up for, they would, and I would act the victim. But I understood exactly what I was doing, and I was down. I accepted the consequences. So then I realized, hey, if I'm willing to accept the consequences, it's obviously not affecting me the way it's affecting other people. You know what I mean? I was really disrupting their peace in a way that was intentional, but at the same time, the way I was washing my hands of it was saying that it's not my fault, in a way it's like it's within you, and it is. Now, what I learned is just because I see a warping here doesn't mean I have to warp it back. I don't have to smack it in the mouth or send it someplace. It's like I can respond to that with only the truth. I don't have to get into this game of negativity and trying to frame things in certain ways. It's like, look, this is all I'm saying. If you want to keep taking it and turning it into whatever, I get it. I'm not going to encourage that, but I'm definitely going to keep on repeating myself. And you don't know how to do this because you don't meditate, because you're only burning hot. And then you end up running out of that gas, exactly as you described. Whereas when you're just emanating the light that you're seeing, it's like, this isn't even nothing to do with me, which is why I don't get tired, because I'm not doing anything but reflecting this light. And you can break that metaphor across a trillion different things. Who has the language to deal with that? Probably the people in optics. And for people who do things with optics, or people who deal with things that operate like lenses, whatever that means in their own respective whatever, so that the moment something comes across their lap and it's like, here's what the report says, they can say, yes, but we're not looking at a circle. We're looking at a sphere, and it's rotating, and our constructs have allowed for us to account for the rotation. However, what we cannot account is that this rotation will continue at this speed, in this direction, in this form. Anything can change at any moment. What if it's a 4-dimensional structure, though? Now the shapes that you've come up with tools to measure in the second or third dimension, like a sphere, now you're dealing with it as if it's a sphere from your circle point of view, or even your line point of view. And what happens if it's not that? What happens if at a higher level, now you got a hypersphere, a rotation in a hypersphere causing a change on a sphere that projects a different change onto a circle, which projects a different change onto a line? It's almost impossible to comprehend. And when you look up into a higher dimension, from a line to a circle, from a circle to a sphere, from a sphere to a hypersphere, if you're admitting that at any level what you're dealing with is not the object of that dimension, but the shadow of a higher one, well, then wherever you stop, you have to assume there are that many steps even higher. So suddenly, the cloud of mysteries collapses back down into a determined state if it's being rotated by higher and higher and higher orders. But that doesn't make sense, but then it does, because we also have another explanation in sheaves where a point that is determined and also determining can be composed of an infinity of variation, just like a song. I have one song, I can play it in all the keys now. And keeping all the tempos the same, I can change the drums from having swing to not, etc., etc. And these were the things that were explored more within those tonnets. So when you look at that, though, the rotation of the higher order, and you look up 64 dimensions, let's say, whatever that means, and at each level, a change at each level is instantly propagated down. The higher you go in dimension, the object that you're dealing with, a shadow, the shadow perfectly describes the object. But at a higher level, that object that's making that shadow has an incomprehensible texture to it in relation to the other dimension that you were looking at. So you mean to say you could keep on climbing up and you can keep on climbing higher? Like it almost looks as if the moment anything is, it is, and it's everywhere instantly at the same time. If only there were people in this world who could formalize that type of thinking for us. You know what I mean? And that's kind of the big joke, because I would love to be able to express that sort of formulation mathematically and then play with those models and see what we get at that level. And that's how it starts transforming on itself, where it's like, well, what was Plato talking about exactly in the allegory of the cave and the shadows and projections and his tender care and this tender care within different institutions to pass forward these ideas that he espoused about Platonic forms and these perfect forms and all this kind of stuff. So we got focused on the solids, which do a tremendous job of encapsulating and explaining and relating a bunch of stuff. But it's those perfect forms that are ill, because Plato says of objects that all objects are actually in transition. They are not the thing itself, but the process of becoming. He didn't talk about emotion like this. Lisa Feldman Barrett has his description of category for emotion, whereas his description of emotion is wrong. Almost. If you attach that notion that anything that is actually in the process of tending towards that which it is becoming, then it's almost like you can almost attach that as a caveat to any object, which is precisely what Schopenhauer did, which is why he's the most fire. I don't know if lambda calculus or anything like that had existed yet, but I mean, this is dot notation. This fool is appending attributes to this thing and defining them. It's just absolutely ill. So it's like, well, what is category theory? Because they keep drawing these weird diagrams, but somehow these diagrams are able to formally express these very technical situations in a very, very real way. And it's dope because we had an allusion to this with programming, with template programming, and we saw it in C, and I mean, people just copy and paste. That's a joke, but it's like, because there's a structure to all these logics, and you could spend the time trying to learn them all so you could spit them out all at once, or you could just know their names and understand their relations and kind of put them together as they end up popping up. So it's like category theory is almost expanding this notion of what Plato was saying. Category theory is trying to formalize the word. So when we say a word, it can 100% have a complex and comprehensive technical description of the thing, and it can be used to describe different. And so now we're talking about these maps that we're constructing, which we're using to give meaning to the points that we're coming in contact with. Once we have a structure for how to deal with them, we know how to move around them. And when we do that, now we're starting to generalize this whole notion of things being in a space and certain traversals to reach or certain traversals to avoid, which is precisely what Jeff Hawkins was talking about. Of activity in the neocortex is a generalization of activity in the grid cells in the entorhinal cortex, and I'm sure there are there's more to that than I can even understand. But that's what he was saying, is concept exists in a space and each concept is a point, but each point can be related in infinite ways, in unimaginable ways. So each point ends up glowing. Anything that's taken in is automatically structured in a way that you're going to take it in. But then when you take it in, you have a structure with how you deal with it. And once you've dealt with how you take it in, then you have other structures with how you, etc., 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 etc. And it's just wildly connected. And when people talk like this from those avenues of teaching, people get mad at them because they're like, oh, they're talking spiritual. It sounds like nonsense, whatever. But then those people very calmly, and I've heard them, I've seen them argue with the set theorists who complain about this, but they're giving technical documents. I mean, they are giving you documentation for this, dog, on top of everything else. They're explaining your frames and more. And it's absolutely wild. So it's like, there is number, and then there's category, and then there's word. And it's like we have this, you know what I mean? This wave. So it's ill. With all the number theory stuff, like the way it all kind of unfolded on itself, I guess. Looking at the allegory of the cave, at the people who were in a cave seeing these projections onto the wall, which were caused by the illumination from the fire. But there are principles you can derive about the behavior of fire if you're staring at the shadows, just of how it moves. So there's a structure you could start to kind of compose. Because even stalagmites last longer on this area of projection, let's say, like on that screen, versus people walking back and forth, or forms walking back and forth. There's some relationship where forms kind of like get one on top of the other and then spread. Or maybe if they're in a room and there's fire that's going, maybe they can tell a density of shadows and all this kind of stuff. And I've thought about it in those terms because that's really how all the ancients, it's like, I don't understand Kant when I read him. Well, it's like, all right, read his stuff and talk about it with your hands and get a feel for, this is probably how this fool was wrestling with these things in his mind. So it's like, with all the things we read, I don't want to talk about necessarily about what I agree with or what I disagree with. That's not the point. The point is, this map that they've constructed, where does it work? Does it ever produce a true value? And with shouting out Wittgenstein, you feel me? Anywhere it doesn't fit, like, why not? You know, so is this map only useful in one type of situation where we have other maps that are useful in more, let's say? So in reading all these people's conceptions of numbers and looking at all their relationships and looking at the shadows that Plato was talking about and how people, they actually get out from this primitive, flat, low fidelity, low resolution representation of image, and then they turn around and they walk out, and it turns out the intuitions that they were furnished with that allowed them to construct these meanings off the wall actually are the same intuitions that they are now using and pointing at the rest of the world. And in that, when they're pointing it at the rest of the world, the light is too bright. It's like the intuitions are necessarily now, because of how things have been kind of stacked one behind the other, they're only built for the darkness. And when you turn it to the light, for some people, or I guess in the story, because that's the funny part, I never read it 100 times, right? The amount of times I read it, it doesn't even matter what it is, because it wasn't enough for me to be able to feel comfortable to say, like, yeah, I read it. So if people brought it up in a conversation, like, yo, you ever read it? I'd be like, whatever. What do you think about it? Because I would love to hear how the intuitions that you are structured with is now taking in this information, processing it, and throwing it back out there, peppered with the you of you. You feel me? That's fire. And that's where I keep on in myself learning the most from people. Again, coming back to this burning bright versus burning hot. It's like, I don't have to turn down my shine. My responsibility is not to singe you with it. So if you don't like the way I'm pronouncing these things, then we don't have to talk about it. You know what I mean? But for those who know what we're talking about, then let's talk. And if you don't vibe, it's cool. I don't ask the questions that you have. So I think that Plato came out and dropped the allegory of the cave the way that he did because when Hippasus was like, there's an irrational number line, they killed that nigga. They drowned him because he took the divinity away from the number and instead brought it back and said, no, there is a framer of numbers. There is something that exists that is teeming. It already has the information necessary that when you populate it with these values, boop, the other values instantly get popped out, right? Any change at one point is instantly propagated across an unimaginable distance. It doesn't make sense. It seems like there's a relation of a higher order. As we're actually required in order to make sense of these things would be something like a decider. I think the Pythagoreans had their pulse on this, and this is why they adored the triangle, because it was already sort of showing you, you know what I mean? It's not there, but it is there. And you know it's there because when you put one thing in there, you automatically have 6 things described. When you name the triangle that you're dealing with, when you give a value to a side, you already know the angles that you're dealing with, and this is why you can automatically construct what the meanings of these other things are. But that's already there. The delay that you have is in computing it in a way that's intelligible to the system that you're computing it through. Because none of us look at a triangle and say, that's not a triangle. You know what I mean? But the math behind it is what gives us this knowledge, like a true knowledge, a true wisdom that as it unfolds and unfurls, you just start witnessing an unimaginable complexity. There is a gravity almost. Any concept, any idea, any relating, there's a weight there. It's like you're holding a sphere. From a distance, it just looks like a 3-dimensional thing. But when you walk up to it, suddenly you're in the center of a room, staring at a vaulted ceiling, and in the vaulted ceiling there's a hole and there's still more light that's shining down through there. It's almost it's unexplainable to be there. It's unexplainable that this is, and then that this is also exists within this realm where light can come through that hole like that. You know what I mean? So when people talk like that, to other people it's different. We've been around these people our whole lives, and all we've said about them is made fun of them for them seeing things that weren't there. But isn't it funny that sometimes they were right? Which was the issue, and what would we call it? Serendipity. And it was, but it wasn't. Because this is what category theory is pointing at. This is what Plato's talking about. This is what establishing operations are. This is what emotion as a frame, as described by Lisa Feldman Barrett and all of her associates, is. It's a shape through which you're changing these shapes. Your information's coming in. The structure, right? But there's a shape that you can change, and when these shapes change, then the outputs that are automatically related to them end up changing. And this is why it's important to empty your mind, because if you come at a frame as something like there's danger here, yeah, maybe there is danger, but you're looking at the wrong place for the danger. Now you're focusing all of your paranoia at the wrong thing. Which means what? The thing that ends up taking you out is the thing you did not expect, right? No one reasonably talks about plague taking a nation. No one reasonably talks about things falling from the sky or water rising from the ground. We have these new descriptions for these things, right? And we really do place ourselves at the center of all of it. But it's like we've always been dealing with the nature of this chaos. There's no way to know. Even when you know, you don't know. That's why category theory is dope. And Jade, I'm not sure if that's her actual name, but she touched on this. Category theory is beautiful, but you don't know anything about the object that you're describing at that level. And that's the importance. You have to populate the value. Not enough just to know the monoidal constructions that are operating on the values. You know, it's like knowing all of these things in relation to each other. This constant flow, this back and forth, this high and low, this or that. And that's why, to me, it's so significant, especially within the ancient Chinese traditions, where these things that arise in binary, right? Lao Tzu's Litany of Opposites, chapter 2, the high defines the low, the wide defines the thin, etc., etc. But that's within a frame of Zhuangzi, where when the bellows speak, when the infinity speaks, the 10,000 things are then emerge from there. And from each one of those, 10,000 more. You know what I mean? They're talking about these logistical maps expanding. They're talking about tree roots and all that kind of stuff. So when he's over here telling us that these opposites arise, it's intrinsic. It's automatic that they're talking about 10,000 opposites arise, if that makes any sense. So what's the scale, though? It's unimaginable. You're standing in wonder. And even if you knew the traversal of butterfly's path, you can have the average. It ends up spiraling around it. You could only compute where it's going based on where it's been. You can't know where it's going, but you kind of can, but then you really can't. And that's it. Like, you can't figure out the lines just based on the path, which makes it even... So to me, that's probability, right? You have a line and a butterfly is populating it with little stars on either side as it goes. And it's like it's in this space, but, you know, you can't predict where it's going to be. So then Zhuangzi comes out with the line of lines, and this fool says that the universe is the memory of a butterfly. What more probabilistic conception is there? What more ephemeral lightheartedness is there? Compounded in that, the butterfly itself represents change and fragility. The fact that it is unbelievable. The wind that blows things down carries butterflies. Get out of here. They are monarchs of the wind. You know what I mean? Amazing. And this isn't even them. This isn't even the face. This isn't even a slice of the face of a crystal on the face of a piece of ice, if that makes any sense. This is less than so in that. The middle of all this numerical nonsense, I hit my mom up, because one of the things I'm hearing from people again, which I haven't heard in over 15 years, is that Christianity is Neoplatonic. Christianity is Neoplatonic. And it really blew my mind. I hadn't heard that for the first time until I went to college. And a bunch of homies in college were my Protestant friends, or they were raised in Protestant traditions, I should say, would tell me this. And when I would talk about my experiences within Catholicism to my friends, they'd be like, oh, you're charismatic. Like, charismatic? Why? Because we went to church on Wednesdays too, and we sang. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't like a thing. Like, there was no, yo, this is what we are. It's just we sing, we dance. And so I myself had a wonderful experience when I went to church with white people for the first time out in Riverside, California, because I realized that the white people I grew up with are not regular white people. When people in America are like, yo, white people, they do not mean white people from Chula Vista by any stretch of the imagination. So when I was at a for real church with for real white people from for real white places, extending through for real white states whose parents came from, or grandparents and great-grandparents came from for real white countries, not Ireland, you feel me? It was like, I was blown away. I couldn't believe it. And I honored it. You know, I was like, wow, this is a wonderful tradition. And it's crazy because a lot of my friends didn't, right? We came from similar backgrounds. We share the faith. So they were like, these fools are... It's just different, but it's dope, because I did have a taste of this when I was younger, and I remember complaining to my mom, and she was kind of like, what are you going to church for? Like, is it to watch somebody perform, or are you there to meditate? Now, this is not to say that there's anything wrong with people singing, which is what my mom was saying. What she was saying is, it's not right to say that this isn't the way I want to hear it, like when you're there. If you ain't feeling it, go somewhere else then, you know what I mean? But you can't just cross your arms and pout while you're in it because you're bored. That's crazy. So when I told my mom, I don't understand why people think that we're like Plato, because what I've read of Plato, I don't necessarily agree, per se, let's say. And of the guys in our Catholic tradition, I don't automatically think of Plato. I think of Aristotle, if anybody, you know what I mean? Including Augustine. So like all these guys that I read reminded me more of Aristotle and guys that wrote in that tradition. It did not strike me as Platonic forms. I didn't see it. And so my mom was like, oh no, it's not that we're Platonic. Like, we're not Platonic, right? He has certain descriptions of how they talk about, how he talks about zero turning on itself and all this kind of stuff. And it's right there in line with our description of how we talk about the incomprehensible nature of God. So that's why to me, it's like, even when I read St. Augustine, I don't necessarily see the Platonic extensions from it, right? To me, the Platonic tradition, which you end up finding is just a contemplative one across many traditions, across many faiths, is this idea of it's not staring into the void, right? That's how some people describe it, and that's how they describe it when they go crazy. But there are other people who talk about this stillness, or other people talk about emptying yourself. And within our Christian traditions, there's very much this idea of pouring yourself out, emptying yourself, and find out. You don't try to reserve your energy, because if you do that, then you lose the charisma, you lose the song. You give more love, God pours more love into you. And they all say this. And I heard that even more from my friends with Protestant traditions, because they were going to Africa. So there's this aspect of like, you know what I mean? It's just, and with that, it's just so hard, because people go to third world countries and they do these things. And for some people, it is a joke. But there are other people who are for real making wells. And it's like, they're not making wells in places that wells don't exist, right? It's like, they're not there to impose their thing. They are there to help. And it's like, tell us how to do the stuff, and we'll kind of look at your frame in your world, right? Instead of coming in and throwing all of our frames on top of you. We did that already, right? It's not the way. That's not how you teach love. That's not how you teach a universal message of extension. It's corrupted. And that was when I saw, oh my gosh, so there are these aspects within our faiths, within our traditions, where we're looking at them like an object instead of thinking of what produced it. And then the language that they use is because within our faith, we always say things like, you know, people look at creation and forget the creator. They look at it the wrong way in modern times. They don't understand what it meant for a learned man, right? For a walking university, in your words, Michael. For one of those people to know these things and just say, dude, the connection between all things is so magnificent, encased within this impossibility of being, that how is it that anything is the way it is outside of the grace of God? But that message can be corrupted when you think you have it. And because you have it, now you think you could do whatever you want, like you've been granted dominion. When you're granted dominion, it is of you to produce more. Let's say I grant you dominion over one farm. Do you think I want one farm back? Within this Christian frame, and this is what there's a specific parable where Jesus talks about this, where the master gives one. And then to one he gives five, and one he gives, and you know, so one guy didn't multiply, but the guy that got the most ended up multiplying the most. And it's like, yo, when you get, you produce. So when people take this beautiful imagery of, yo, we have the truth, you can tell if they do or not. You have to really look, though. You can't just say it like a meme and say, look at their fruits. You're not looking at the whole tree sometimes, and you're being unfair, and you're being a hypocrite when you kind of you expand the scope more than it should. Looking at the person within there. And that's the joke, right? So we could say a lot of people doing missionary trips are doing things with ulterior motives and whatever. That's a reality. That's really there. That really happens. But I'm not going to assume that every person I meet that does that did it for that reason. In fact, there are people that have been involved in it gets so deep. They sacrifice so much for peace in the name of peace, and they really it's massive. It is very massive, and it's not fair to call that person, to judge them. We shouldn't judge at all, and that's the point. Because if you get it wrong once, it's not worth it. It is not worth accusing one innocent person. Better to err and let a killer go free than kill one innocent person. That is what our faith is about. And that's what we're all about, right? Up until certain situations. And then we turn around and look at the victim, right? And talk about all the ways the victim could have changed their behavior, which in some cases, if you want to be purely pragmatic, sure, let's take that into consideration. Let's say that this is the reality of a thing. However, the way we structure things after that cannot be in a way that allows that, because that's not what we're about. You know what I mean? But when my mom told me that, it gave me such an appreciation. I mean, in the first page of the catechism, people always clown it, right? But it says in there that within us, we have this calling to seek God. And the catechism says that you could almost argue that man was made to be a religious being, to seek the unknown. And so these things come forth, and there's just so much, and there's also so much ambiguity. This is absolutely significant, because there's other aspects of our faith where you're told, read everything, hold fast to what is good, in a very, very real way. When you think you have the truth, you assume that it must spring always from you, but it's not. And within our faith, the argument would be, look at each searches outside of the frame in order to bring things to fruition, right? To bring a culmination. This is within our faith, but we see this principle enacted time and time again on the outside. So there are times where the outsider, dare I say, the stone that was cast aside was then taken and used as the cornerstone. You can see that principle in so many things, right? You could talk about Michael Jordan getting kicked off of a team, okay, turning around and then practicing. You could talk about Kobe Bryant not being allowed to play for however many years. People are pissed about that. They were like, he should have been up front line from day one. What have his career have been? But then you look at the backside of it, and it's like, and who knows what was going on in the background with all of those structures. So it's just so powerful. It's absolutely profound when you start looking at the ways that all the peoples contemplate on the stuff, from the mathematics to the art. It's just all so wonderful. It's all so complex. There's an infinity within each location, and we can call each location a type of study or whatever, you know what I mean? The Mayans had conceptions of zero. The way that they counted on their hands was just, who knows what could have happened had electricity been more formally explored in relation to those cultures a little bit closer, right? Like, what if our conception of a modem could have been somehow more related to a conch shell than it is now? Not to say it is or isn't. When those things start happening, you can see the beauty of the spirit and the way in which it manifests itself through each frame. So it's like, that's the respect and honor that you have to have for the frames. We're all looking at the same creation, aren't we? There is ambiguity, isn't there? Within any one of our systems, there has to be mystery. There's mystery. There are things that whatever you have, you cannot fully explain things. Like, there's a limit to how far you can explain some things. And there are some things that cannot be explained until way, way later. And some things have no explanation, but you see the way in which they lead towards whatever. So it's like, yeah, you could turn around and say that had meaning, but it only had meaning to the effect that you made it meaningful after the point that was determined. The point that is determined is now determining, and that's the importance. So it's just crazy. Anything, exactly like you said, things fall from the sky. what if they brought the microbes to do X, Y, or Z, right? So it's like there was a necessary end to one frame of things, which gave rise to another. That's on the large scale and on the small scale. So when we use words like, God, you make the big small and the small big, you make the near far and the far near, it's exactly with that respect where when you're talking, when you say a father and his 12 sons, are you talking about a father and his 12 sons? Or are you talking about a federation of nations within a nation? And you can climb up and down and jump and then find more and more smaller representations of each thing. Jesus' death and subsequent resurrection can have an analogy in Jonah. And Jonah ended up in the well because he didn't listen to God and he was trying to run away. Whereas Jesus had the chance to run away and didn't, and in obedience ended up going into this metaphorical whale then in comparison to what that whale was, because that whale was for non-obedience. And the message that he was supposed to deliver was one of destruction. He was supposed to go to this city and tell them, y'all ain't living according to the way, so now everything's going to be destroyed. He runs away. He ends up getting swallowed up by this whale after putting other people at risk. Then he ends up going to the city after all, and the city ends up being saved. And then he's upset that the city was not destroyed. And so God shows him why he was wrong even in that. Because it's about love. It's about mercy. And the image of how God shows Jonah that he's in the desert and he finds shade beneath a vine, and it gives him shade for a day, and then God destroys the vine or has worms attack the vine, something to that effect. The vine dies. So now Jonah's out there for 24 hours. Now that dude is gonna die, but then he doesn't, and he kind of complains to God like, yo, just take me, bro. Like, why would you even make me be here? And the moral of the story being, look how much you loved that vine which you didn't even produce. Now you want me to turn around and destroy a garden which I have tended to since before? Because that was the point of all of this? Who are you to expect that of me? This isn't just about throwing fire at people. It's about love. And that's my issue always with people quoting Revelations, because I'm like, look, the imagery is wild, bro, but there's so much more love and triumph and to that, right? It's not just falling. It's almost like people are trying to force you to fall to prevent an ascension. That's the point of the story. And so you are to be the lights. Step on the head of the snail, you know what I mean? Or the snail, that's savage. Don't. Step on the head of the snake, you know what I mean? Or look towards where that can happen. So that's what ends up happening with these things, because people always want to just turn it into some kind of, they themselves then want to make the small big, or then the big small. And it's like, that's not what it is. These are frames for relating the facts. They themselves are the facts in that they are processing, you know what I mean? But you can't sit here and be like, this is that, because that's not that. There is a necessary evolution to these things because of choice and righteousness within our frame when we say those things. Which is why when we don't talk like that, that's why Richard roars fire, bro. He talks about the cosmic Christ in this very way. Christ, Cristo, Christos. This means the anointed, the living water. You're not trying to drown people in baptism, you feel me? It all just gets so absolutely ancient, 100% ancient, and you can't help but feel this sort of honor and veneration for it. It's not a clamoring, it's this stillness, this emanation of a wind, as if you're standing in a cave. You realize suddenly the glory of the cathedral that you are inside, and how we are 100% bound to each other. And when we say we are all bound by Christ, we don't mean if we are bound by Christ if you believe in him. That's insanity. That defeats the purpose of our stuff. You know what I mean? Because that ain't love. And even Christos talks about that when he's like, you don't get props to a thief for feeding his kid. People feed kids. You get props for turning the cheek 77 times 77 times. How do you even do that? You know what I mean? It's an impossibility, and that's the thing, because all of us have a limit somewhere, right? And it's just ill. And that was the other part when I was talking to my mom. She was telling me about Saint Michael, the ascension of Saint Michael, how in the garden, the word Lucifer means light, right? This was the first. He was the second in command, and it was through pride that he ends up losing his lot because he sought more. He didn't want to serve and ended up relegated to what it is he's relegated to, and the name was stripped from him. But it's beautiful because my mom said this conception of him standing with a sword wasn't a matter of him swinging it. There's an element of stillness. God did not move a finger to cast these dudes out, and neither did Michael. It was an emanation, and that emanation was love. So the angel Michael is often depicted holding this flaming sword, and it's not that he used the sword to swing and fight and battle necessarily, which, you know, I mean, we have these conceptions, you know what I mean? There's seasons to this kind of stuff, which is the point. The point of the emanation is that of stillness. It is not through attack that you repel darkness, but by planting yourself firmly, by having a foundation that will not be shaken, neither by wind, nor by water, nor by armies, nor anything, and simply emanating the truth and the love that forces them away. And that was that conception where it was the emanation of this light became so intense that in a fury, the enemy leaves because of the light, not force.